All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today I am joined by my guest, Allen Strk, a contributor at the Falcoholic, the former co-host of the Locked On Falcons podcast. And today we're going to be talking all about Matt Ryan's legacy and what the Falcons do next at the quarterback position.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans. And, of course, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. And, of course, you can find Locked On Falcons on a variety of podcast platforms, including Odyssey, Apple, Google, Spotify, and, of course, on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to all the Locked On Falcons channels and give us a like on YouTube when you do. So today I'm joined by Allen Strk. If you're a long-time listener of the Locked On Falcons podcast, even going back to the days of when it was the FalcFans podcast, RIP, you know Allen Strk, my former co-host here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And when I sat here being like, we haven't really sat down and really talked about Matt Ryan and what he meant for this team, and I figured, like, who better to talk about this than Allen Strk? Maybe Dave Choate was number one on my list, but Dave declined, and so I had to go number two with Allen. No, I'm kidding. So, Allen, my friend, welcome back to Locked On Falcons. And when we talk about Matt Ryan's legacy, because I remember you know, when I first started interacting with you back in the mid-aughts, whatever we call those years, where Jim Mora Jr. and Bobby Petrino were the coach or whatever, and you were just some snot-nosed middle schooler, you know, all in caps lock typing at the falcfans.com forums and whatnot. You know, like, obviously you have memories of the Falcons before Matt Ryan, but really sort of your coming of age has been this entire Matt Ryan 14-year history. So I figure, you know, what are your thoughts on sort of these last 14 years of Matt Ryan and what he brought to this franchise?
You have to look back to 2008 because just the darkness of it, because there was so much questioning after 2007, just all the scandals, all the toxicity, you know, and it was kind of the changing of guard because you saw a lot of those veterans out there, because people forget that was such a veteran-filled team. You know, you're talking about the Wark Dunn, Algie Crumpler, John Abraham, Keith Brooking, Laura Malloy, and you knew that given that it was going to be a long rebuild, there was going to be a huge transition. And then to see Matt Ryan come in there, and it was a controversial pick, and we talked about Dave Choate. Dave Choate would have mentioned Glenn Dorsey by now, but thankfully the Thomas Dimitri did not listen to him, and we took it from there. And the thing that I think I most appreciate about Matt Ryan, just off the top, was just the integrity and the professionalism of it. Like, he came into a real questionable situation where, you know, no one really knew about Dimitrov and Mike Smith. Like, I remember Marcellus Wiley was even talking about how Mike Smith didn't really even call the plays in Jacksonville, and he doesn't even know why he got the job. So there was just stuff like, what is this team even going to look like? They're projected to win like 2 games that year. Because I always used to read the Sports Illustrated preview, and I'd be like, oh my God, the Falcons are going to go 2-14. I'm a sophomore in high school. This is going to be so embarrassing. And then they won 11 games, and things just took off. And you just saw those 5 years, they built a real winning foundation. Even though it wasn't pretty at times, you just had that feeling like, okay, Matt Ryan's always going to keep them competitive. He's not going to really embarrass them. He's going to lead them to late game comebacks. He's going to put them in a position to win. He's going to build a great rapport with Roddy White and Tony Gonzalez. It was just comforting to finally have that security and that consistency. It's like, okay, we kind of know what to expect on Sundays. And that's what Matt Ryan brought throughout his 14 years. Even through the darkest of times, you knew he was going to make a couple of big time throws and make 1 or 2 of those wild plays with his legs that everyone goes crazy over. That's the things that we enjoy, and things we've become accustomed to seeing. And I think even through, once again, all the dark times, it was always great to appreciate, like, good to really good to MVP caliber quarterback play. And, you know, that's something that we should all be grateful for.
Yeah, I think, you know, you real great point. We've gotten so accustomed to it that we kind of take it for granted, sort of what that is and having what that is at the quarterback position, the most important position on the football field. And I know a lot of Falcon fans, particularly over the last couple of years, have focused on sort of Matt Ryan's shortcomings and all the things that he hasn't necessarily accomplished here in Atlanta. But I think people forget all the things that he did accomplish here in Atlanta, and, forgetting that, prior to Matt Ryan's arrival, like, this Falcons organization, this Falcons franchise was not particularly good. I'm not going to sit here and say like they're the LA Clippers or anything like that, but they were not thought in high regard. And, they would basically have one good season and then go in the tank for like 3 or 4 years before they could sort of rebound. They were like a bad college program where it's like, oh, when we get our one good recruiting class, and then when those guys are seniors, we can go to the playoffs and lose to, some good team. And then once those guys graduate, well, it's back starting all over again. And that was kind of the Falcons' MO, certainly when I started watching them in the 90s and early 2000s. So I think people, it's hard to sort of really appreciate that, because you've grown accustomed to the Falcons always being a competitive team over these last 14 years. Getting into the end now, did you ever see it sort of ending in the way that it did? Obviously, it seemed like the last couple of years, it wasn't as if he was going to go out with some sort of huge fanfare where he was going to ride off into the sunset, hoisting a Lombardi trophy. Although I'm sure a lot of people had those dreams initially when Arthur Smith and company was hired. And even myself had fleeting fantasies about, who was going to stop, this Falcons offense helmed by Julio and Calvin Ridley and Kyle Pitts and Matt Ryan and whatnot, But did you ever sort of see it coming to an end in the way that it did this past week?
No, because there's just so much murkiness behind it. Like, we all know about the whole Deshaun Watson situation and 22 solo cases, and it's just everything just felt really unsettling. And I know I checked out Matt Ryan's press conference. I know he spoke about the organization high regard, as he, as always is, because he's just a consummate professional. But just seeing the reporting of it, not really hearing from Terry Fontenot or Arthur Smith, which I guess they don't need to make a statement, but at least something would have been nice. But it just felt really just kind of questionable. Like, I just didn't like how it just came out of nowhere. And then I just never in my wildest dreams thought, Matt Ryan, we trade for a 3rd-round pick. That's probably the biggest shock of this all. Like, I'm still trying to comprehend how it's possible. Yes, I know his age, but you can't convince me that he's on the level of Carson Wentz or, say, Jimmy Garoppolo got traded via a 3rd-round pick. Like, it's hard for me to believe that. And we can make all the jokes, but like the fact that not just Julio Jones, but even Mohamed Sanu, which they got better draft haul for. That's probably the thing that just really, wow, like, that really happened, huh? So, look, maybe that's just Matt Ryan being either criminally underrated, or maybe age is really a factor behind the decisions. But that's probably the biggest thing that stood out, besides the whole dirtiness of the situation, but just the fact that they only got a 3rd-round pick, because I still think Matt Ryan could be, around a top 15 quarterback.
Okay, well, we'll get into, I got some thoughts on them only getting a 3rd-round pick. So we'll get into that as we continue today's episode here with Allen Strk, talking about Matt Ryan and his legacy, talking a little bit more about sort of how things kind of went down here at the end. And I got some thoughts for Terry and them coming up on today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we get there, guys, I want to tell you about Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar out there on the market. Built Bar is a protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, even better than a candy bar, because it not only tastes good, it's good for you. It's low in sugar, low in calories, low in carbs, high in protein. And Built Bar is all about their puff flavors this month. Puffs are the first ever protein-infused marshmallow, and they come in a variety of delicious flavors. They just dropped a limited time flavor like brownie batter puff. So if you're a big fan of licking the bowl when you're making those brownies, you can do so by eating a Built Bar with that puff flavor. But you can also get the churro puff, the banana cream puff, coconut marshmallow, ruby chocolate, lemon dip cheesecake. All that and more can be found at built.com. And when you head over to the website, make sure you use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So, Allen, you already sort of talked about how the Falcons did not sort of handle this properly. You mentioned how they haven't really talked about it. I think as we're recording this on Tuesday evening, most people are listening to this on Wednesday morning or Wednesday afternoon. I think the Falcons have a press conference scheduled for Wednesday morning. with Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith. So I imagine they will get their opportunity to stand to have their feet held to the fire, because I'm certain Atlanta media, at least the people I know in Atlanta media, are certainly going to grill them quite a bit for this past week of actions and inactions. But I'm curious, how did you think about that whole situation with Deshaun Watson last week and sort of their pursuit of Deshaun Watson? And do you feel like that was an insult to Matt Ryan, or do you feel like that was the right move for the Falcons to go after, potential elite quarterback in Deshaun Watson? Sort of, how did you feel about that whole situation?
And I just don't know how you could say in good faith if a team is right for pursuing Deshaun Watson. Obviously, the talent speaks for itself, but just given the situation and still the unknown, I just don't see how in good faith you can do it. Not to mention, if you want to talk about from a pure team building standpoint, 3 first-round picks, and who knows what the financial cost would be. I don't think the Falcons are in any sort of position to make such a blockbuster move. So, taking the personal stuff aside, from a team building standpoint, I think it could have been very detrimental. Not to mention there's a likely 6 to 8 game suspension, if not more, for him. So I just think there was way more cons than the slight pros. And I know some people say, oh, they finally could fill out the stadium, and that's probably a big reason why Arthur Blank was heavily pushing for his move. It's like, okay, we could now, for the next 8 to 10 years, no more empty seats, which has been kind of a common theme for the Falcons for the past few years. But now overall, nothing about it really felt right. Like, I just remember seeing that tweet, I think it was like the last Tuesday morning, from Schefter, and it was just like, really? Like, you have an organization that preaches about integrity and good faith, and they can talk about due diligence, but I have a hard time believing in it. And I just think, once again, from the team building standpoint and the moral standpoint, there was just no way they could have done it. And look, I know we talk about all this business, but there's got to be a human decency side to it. And there was a lot of talk from whether it was Chris Mortensen or other insiders about how Matt Ryan will absolutely be on the team. And, within a month, you see Watson, being heavily rumored to the Falcons. It's crazy how things switched up. And no, it didn't make me feel good about it at all.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to the combine, and Arthur Smith was publicly on record saying, our plan is to sort of build up the team and then go get the quarterback, or whatever the case may be. And then 2 weeks later, they're basically like, no, screw that. We're all in on Deshaun Watson, so we're going to throw picks at that. And then that kind of just screws up their ability to trade Matt Ryan. And they basically get nothing for him, a 3rd-round pick. You look at what the Colts gave up for Carson Wentz a year ago, compared to what they got back for Carson Wentz this year, where they got 2 3rd-round picks and then moved up in the 2nd round, which is basically, if you look at the trade value charts, worth the equivalent of another 4th-round pick. So they got pretty much 3 times as much for Carson Wentz as the Falcons got for Matt Ryan. And that's the difficult thing for me. It's where the idea of trading Matt Ryan is not the crazy part to me, because basically anybody who's listened to Locked On Falcons for last year knows I've been basically saying eventually they're going to move on from Matt Ryan. It's just a matter of when that is, and it's probably going to happen sooner than people think, particularly at least those people that thought he was going to play until he was 40 here in Atlanta. But it's just the idea that okay, you move on from Matt Ryan, but then you get nothing in return for him. I would much rather if the Falcons got a 3rd-round pick next year, right, then a 3rd. What does that do? That doesn't do anything, at least the 3rd-round pick next year is okay, we're adding assets to build around in the future, or whatever the case may be. I don't know. It's just crazy to me that the Falcons got so swindled on that deal. It's just everybody's sitting here talking about, hey man, look, it's incredible that the Colts were able to basically turn Carson Wentz into Matt Ryan and got a 3rd-round pick in addition to that, and saved money on their on the salary cap. And
we haven't talked about the dead cap yet. Oof.
And if you're going to take a $40 million cap hit, dead money cap hit, then get something for it, get something worthwhile for it, other than a guy that maybe has a 30% chance of becoming a quality starter, which is basically the best case scenario for a 3rd-round pick. So it just all is just a giant mess that they just completely botched this trade from that standpoint. And then you couple that with the unknown of not having the quarterback situation secured. So that's really where my frustration lies.
I also want to point out that none of this really was supposed to happen. It could have easily been avoided. You even heard the press conference today. Matt Ryan said, I he still had feelings like he wished he could have stayed in Atlanta. Like maybe not completely, but there was no inclination that he said I'd want to totally out. It was just the opportunity was there, and he obviously felt some type of way. The disrespect was there. So, but if none of this happened, he easily could have still been a quarterback for another year, which I think would have been ultimately most beneficial for a team. But they took a high profile risk and it blew up in their face, and Falcons are back to being kind of a punchline.
Yeah. Now you talk about potentially having him on for another year. A lot of people will say that they finally are embracing the rebuild. Now they sort of ripped the Band-Aid off and are sort of now finally doing the thing that I think a lot of people thought that they should have started doing last offseason. Where do you stand on that notion?
I would think to wish the roster was better because they still have so many holes. At least try to bolster the roster a little bit more before, look, it is a rebuild. We know that, but at least put the future in a better position. Now it's just like this could easily be the worst team in the league if things go really awry, and that's scary considering they were fairly competitive. Like say what you want, but they were in the playoff hunt in January. As crazy as it was. Now it's just they have so many holes, and it's just the one huge stabilizing factor isn't there. And now it's just there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's not a lot of those we talked about those blue chip players like maybe 2 or 3 of them at most, and to lose out on the one who yes he was aging and there was some limitations offense, but you watched some of those games last year, like especially when the game at New Orleans, that was one of the best QB performances I've seen all year period. Name me any quarterback. I put Matt Ryan's performance against pretty much anyone. I thought he was flawless in that game. And those are the times with things you lose when you get rid of a player like Matt Ryan without having a real succession plan. But look, we give the organization, I guess, some time. There's a draft coming up, but I think giving it another year, not taking such a dead cap hit and just trying to bolster the roster as best as possible would have been the best move.
Okay. Now you talk about the succession plan. We do know, at least theoretically, who is potentially likely to start week 1 for the Falcons. That is, of course, Marcus Mariota. And we'll pick Allen's brain on what he thinks the Falcons should do for the future now that the future is presumably here at the quarterback position as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Locked On NFL podcast, which you can find on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. Make sure you check out Locked On NFL as those guys cover all the stories going on around the league, in all the signings, all the trades, all that various stuff. So follow Locked On Falcons on your preferred podcast platform. So, guys, I also want to tell you about how I recently started taking a new product by Athletic Greens. It's called AG1, and it's getting me better gut health, more energy, and I'm getting that in the morning, drinking a cup of that every morning instead of slurping down, 2 to 3 cups of coffee. And so I'm, cutting back on my sugar, cutting back on my caffeine. And I've been taking the AG1 for now a couple of weeks now, and I feel pretty energized every single morning. 1 scoop of AG1 is giving you 75 high value vitamins, minerals, whole food source, superfoods, probiotics, adaptogens that help you start your day right, boost your gut health, nervous system, immune system, energy, recovery, and focus, all with AG1. Tons of people are taking some kind of multivitamin, and it's important to take one that has high quality ingredients that your body will absorb. Right now, it's time to reclaim your health and arm your immune system with convenient daily nutrition. Just 1 scoop in a cup of water every single day, and that's all you got to do. No need for a million different pills and supplements to look out for your health. Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/NFL network. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/NFL network to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. So, Alan, we know that the Falcons added Marcus Mariota, Monday before they even officially announced Matt Ryan's being traded. So that kind of tells you the official site was a little sort of caught off guard, trying to play catch up on that. But what are your thoughts on Marcus Mariota being the Falcons quarterback for the immediate future?
I think it's the best option when it comes to that bridge quarterback that people like to use, in terms of that term. I think Mariota still has a lot to prove, especially after the past few years, but he's always kind of been that intriguing alternative, even though he is a bit conservative. But I don't know. Like I'm a little questioning 2 years though. That's the thing. Like, why would it be 2 years? Do you have an explanation for that?
Well, the way they structure the contract, it's really a 1-year deal. And then he has
Okay.
like an option bonus or a roster bonus next year that's due on like the 5th day of the league year. And basically, if the Falcons don't exercise that option, they can save like $12 million by cutting him or whatever the
Okay.
case may be. So it's really like a 1 year. And I think his cap hit this year is like $4 million. So it's basically like a 1 year, like $6 million contract or whatever the case may
Gotcha.
be.
Gotcha. But I do think, back to on the field standpoint, like, I think Arthur Smith, the familiarity, they could run more option. Like, I think he provides a little bit more intrigue and versatility. So, I think you can't really be critical of the move. It's just I was a little concerned about the logistics of it, but besides that, I think it's a solid, low risk, high reward option. Even though Mariota has his faults, he does turn over the ball a little bit too much, but I think he's someone with his legs and toughness, and like you saw a couple plays, like he provided that jolt for the Raiders at times. Even though he had limited reps, you noticed at times it was like, okay, when the offense need a spark, you can do it. So I'm intrigued a little bit by it, but at the same time, I think ultimately this team's going to have to take a quarterback, whether it be in the first or second round. Coming up in
Yeah,
April.
I think Mariota is a good player. I think theoretically, you would not suffer a massive drop off from Matt Ryan to Marcus Mariota relative to what the money is, right?
Mhm.
Theoretically, right? Like you're paying Matt Ryan, $30+ million, and you're paying Marcus Mariota like, $6 million or whatever the case may be, but you're not getting like, whatever that is, 80% less the player, right? You're maybe getting like 20% less the player. So I think you can get league average play from Marcus Mariota. And, I went back and watched that one game that he played against the Chargers with the Raiders in 2020 on Thursday night, where he had to step in for an injured Derek Carr, and he played really well. And the Raiders almost won that game. They sent it into overtime and whatnot. Him and that Darren Waller connection was really in sync that night. So you sort of intrigued by, okay, if he can hook up with Darren Waller like that, what can he do with Kyle Pitts this year? But the problem is, like, right now, the Falcons can't even put Zay Jones or Nelson Aguilar on the field at the wide receiver position. So there's some room for improvement. But I think you're right. With his ability to make plays with his legs, he is a functional NFL starter. And, I talked about this last summer when it comes to reclamation projects, and everybody was getting hyped about, Josh Rosen coming to Atlanta and being this reclamation project. And I basically said, like, the successful reclamation projects, when you look back over the last 30 years, the Rich Gannons, the Kurt Warners, the Ryan Tannehills, all of these guys had 50 plus NFL career starts before they, quarterback is such a mental position that when you're going to ultimately figure it out, it's going to be because you from the neck up, you figure it out. And so when you're looking at reclamation projects, a player like a Jameis Winston, a player like a Marcus Mariota, even to a certain extent, someone like a Mitch Trubisky with the Steelers, those are reclamation projects that kind of make sense because those guys have gotten enough starts that you can sit here and say, like, okay, they just need a certain situation. Obviously, I'm not going to sit here and try to sell people on the idea that Marcus Mariota is going to suddenly look like the player that he could have looked like, or what Titans fans thought he would look like in Tennessee. Although he did have a couple of really good years there in Tennessee, before it was in. But I think this is, a decent option if the goal is to stay competitive. I think Mariota makes a ton of sense. The problem is history kind of tells us that, if you don't necessarily believe that this Falcons roster is particularly good, and all I heard from Falcon fans all last year was this is one of the worst rosters in the NFL. And so, I don't think they've improved it significantly. Then I think the problem is that when you have situations like this, whether you're looking at the Bears or Texans last year, when you have these bridge quarterbacks on a team that's not a playoff contender, which I don't think anybody really thinks the Falcons are a playoff contender, rightfully so. Ultimately, these bridge quarterbacks don't last a full season because at a certain point, if the team has a young quarterback that they wind up picking, and I still feel that it's very likely that the Falcons are going to take a quarterback this year. Ultimately, you get off to these 1-3 starts or whatever the case may be. You're just like, why are we playing Marcus Mariota when we know he's not the future? Let's see what this young guy has to do, and let's get him the reps that he needs to potentially develop. So even though I like the Mariota signing in a vacuum, it probably, I'm not expecting Mariota to start 17 games for the Falcons this year.
Yeah, especially given that he holds onto the ball very long, and you cannot hold the ball long behind that offensive line that has really not seen any improvement so far in the offseason. So that's a big concern. I guess the one thing I do want to note is that Mariota maybe being in the Falcons organization, it'll give him that confidence back, just like he felt in Week 4 of the 2019 season when he put on a spectacular performance. And maybe he could just build his confidence back up and just knowing, all right, I'm in this environment now. When to me, like I thought that was his last great performance, but you did bring up the Thursday night game, which he looked good in as well. But I'd be remiss not to mention that quite memorable 2019, which I think was kind of like the downfall for Dan Quinn.
Yeah, that game will live in infamy in my brain because AJ Brown cooked us in that game. He absolutely cooked us. Or no, not us. Desmond Trufant. I'm sorry, I got to throw my guy under the bus, but yeah.
I thought Isaiah Oliver got his as well. Who, by the way, congrats on the re-sign for him.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I know, Alan, you're not a big draft guy, but do you have any sort of thoughts on what you would like to see the Falcons do at this quarterback position moving forward, or are you big on the Felipe Franks bandwagon?
Absolutely not the Felipe Franks. Come on now. Those 9 snaps, not one of them worked. That was the funniest part of this all. There wasn't a single time where it resulted in more than like a 2-yard gain. And I think more times not, it resulted in a loss of yards. So yeah, that experiment, what a total disaster. I'm intrigued by Malik Willis. I think it's hard not to be. I think he's kind of like the gold standard in an otherwise forgettable class. Kenny Pickett, I want to do more research of, but of course I don't want the Falcons to take him because you're going to become insufferable, and you already become too insufferable. So we don't need that. But Malik Willis is definitely intriguing. I know some people are going to hype up Desmond Riddler, but I don't know, from what I've seen, look, I know young quarterbacks can mature, but he just seems to put the ball in harm's way way too much.
Okay.
What do you think?
We got 3 quarterback takes from Allen, so it's 3 more than you usually give on the draft. So appreciate it.
What do you think? Besides Kenny Pickett's small hands, of course.
I don't have a preference on any of these quarterbacks. They're all just kind of like, they all have different strengths and weaknesses or whatever the case may be. Like it doesn't really matter to me. They're all like, I've said it before, like every single one of these guys, when you look at like the top 6 guys, with the exception of Matt Corral out of Ole Miss. But whether it's Carson Strong, whether it's Desmond Ridder, Kenny Pickett, Sam Howell, or Malik Willis, like I think if someone said that's my QB1, I'd be like, yeah, I get it. You value X, Y, and Z. And if someone says no, the other guys might, okay, you value A, B, and C. Like it's really pick your flavor, of quarterback. And I get why, people are enamored with Malik Willis because of the traits and whatnot. And I think, my personal opinion is I like Malik Willis. I don't like him enough that, people talking themselves into him for a top 10 pick doesn't really make any sense to me, because I'm just like, okay, he's not that good. But I think a lot of people are like, look, if you're going to bet on somebody, and I think a lot of people are looking at how they kind of whiffed on Josh Allen or how they were lower on Justin Herbert than they probably should have been. And they're saying like, okay, the lesson we learned was the traits matter more than necessarily the system they came from and how they executed it or whatever the case may be. I think Malik Willis is probably a little bit of an overcorrection, particularly as a top 10 pick, first round pick. If he went 20 to the Steelers or 18 to the Saints, like that's to me perfect spot to sort of gamble on his upside. But people talking about taking him 2 overall to the Lions or the Panthers at 6 or the Falcons at 8. I'm like, that's too much for me. But
the consensus opinion I think about the QB class is that some team's going to take one in the top 10 and probably regret it. Like to me, from what I've gathered, is that nobody should be taking quarterback in the top 10.
Yeah. I mean, I said it before, like, if you're stacking this quarterback class between where Mac Jones went last year, 15, and you say, okay, that's where Mac Jones should have been drafted. Although, of course, revisionist history could change that. But like, let's say Matt Jones is the middle of the first round guy. And then the next quarterback, I think, was Kyle Trask at like 63 or something like that. Like, I think all these quarterbacks fit somewhere in between 15 and 63. So drafting those guys in that range makes perfect sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Drafting them higher than that, it feels like you're just really, really reaching on those guys.
Yeah, and that's what's going to aggravate the fan bases. And I don't want to reiterate this because they probably heard this several times, but it's just like it was such a great QB class last year. If you really wanted one, why don't you just go get one and trade Ryan? Now you wait a year, and who knows what this class is going to look like. And uh, that's where the anchor lies. But who knows? Maybe they'll take a premium. Maybe they'll take like edge rusher at 8, and then maybe pull a Dimitrov and trade back into the first round. That could happen.
Yeah. Well,
can we end that on a positive note?
yeah, sure. Go ahead.
As you go, at least Baker Mayfield will not be playing in Atlanta.
Okay.
That's a positive.
Okay, there you go.
Because this is an organization that needs an adult at quarterback. Well, they need to start acting like adults and then hopefully get the adult at quarterback.
Okay, there you go. It's not as positive as I thought you were going, but we'll take what we can get at this point in time. So, guys, that's going to do it for us here with Allen Strk on Atlanta Falcons. Allen, go ahead and tell the listeners what you've been up to and what you got coming for them in the near future on all the platforms that you're on.
Well, I'm sure right now we're going to be at the Falcoholic doing all the Matt Ryan tribute pieces possible. Me and Dave Cho did a free agency roundup. We talked about Casey Hayward, Damian Williams, who was a bigger loss between Russell Gage and Foyle Lucan, a couple more free agency tidbits. But now I think this is going to be the week of Matt Ryan tributes, and then who knows, maybe we'll do some more stuff with the organization and what the landscape is looking like. But besides that, we're just covering news on hopefully a receiver or two gets signed, and then full speed ahead towards the draft.
There you go. So, guys, that's going to do it for us here on Locked On Falcons. Tomorrow, we are going to revisit the topic that sort of started all this, which is the Deshaun Watson, as we will have Daniel Luss, a sports lawyer who specializes in sports law, come on the podcast and really break down that whole Deshaun Watson legal stuff and the civil suits and all these various things so that we can really get a good idea of like, okay, why did we exactly blow this whole thing up? Was this worth it? So we'll get his thoughts on that whole Deshaun Watson situation. And then on Friday, we should get Free Agent Friday. So finally, we will talk about the players that the Falcons added, like Casey Hayward, like some of these other players that the Falcons picked up over the last week while all these quarterback shenanigans were going on. So you can stay tuned here on Locked On Falcons, of course, for that. Make Locked On Falcons your first listen, but I always have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And of course, in addition to checking out the local shows like Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, make sure you check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast if you want to get insights into Malik Willis's pro day on Tuesday. And it's a big week of pro days with Kenny Pickett earlier this week. I guess the Falcons are skipping Matt Corral's pro day on Wednesday if they're doing their press conference, or maybe they're doing it remotely in a back room somewhere in Ole Miss on their campus or whatever the case may be. But there's plenty of pro days this week. And so make sure Locked On NFL Draft has you covered for all of that going on around the nation. And of course, you can find Locked On NFL Draft podcast on your favorite podcast platform, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, as well as on YouTube. Guys, that's going to do it for us here. Appreciate it. Till then.